Like, there's a lone wolf part of me that maybe you can relate to, but I like being by myself.
There is something about turning 60 that changes a man. The noise of youth quiets down. The need to prove something fades, slowly at first, then all at once. And if you are James Hetfield, the man who built one of the greatest heavy metal bands in the history of recorded music, that age brings with it a different kind of reckoning. Not with the world, but with yourself. With the choices you made when you were 21 and running on adrenaline, arrogance, and cheap beer. With the people you hurt along the way, not always out of cruelty, but sometimes out of fear. James Hetfield turned 61 in 2024. And in interviews over the past couple of years, something has quietly shifted in the way he speaks. The walls are not entirely gone, they never will be. Not for a man who built emotional armor the way Hetfield built guitar tones, with careful, deliberate craft. But there are cracks now. Honest ones. And through those cracks, one name keeps surfacing. A name that has shadowed Metallica's legacy for over 4 decades. A name that carries equal parts genius and grievance. Dave Mustaine. To understand why Hetfield is finally speaking more openly about Mustaine and Megadeth at this stage of his life, you have to understand the full arc of what happened between them. Not the tabloid version. Not the fan forum mythology. The actual human story underneath it all. A story about 2 extraordinarily talented men, a brutal decision made in the heat of youth, and 40 years of living with the consequences. In 1981, Metallica was not yet Metallica in the way the world would come to know them. They were a young band in the San Francisco Bay Area, grinding through rehearsal spaces, chasing a sound that didn't quite exist yet. James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich had the ambition, but they needed something else. They needed a guitar player who could match the violence of their vision. Dave Mustaine answered that call. And from the moment he walked into a rehearsal, it was clear he was different. His playing was aggressive and technically sophisticated in ways that most musicians his age simply were not. He had speed, yes, but more than that he had ideas, dark, angular, unpredictable musical ideas that pushed the band into territory they hadn't mapped yet. Songs like The Four Horsemen and Jump in the Fire carry his DNA in ways that the official songwriting credits have never fully captured, a fact that would become one of the most enduring points of contention in metal history. But Mustaine also came with something else, volatility. His struggles with alcohol were severe, even by the loose standards of early 80s heavy metal culture. The incidents mounted. There were confrontations with crew members, arguments that escalated past the point of repair. A moment involving his dog-damaging bandmate Ron McGovney's car became a breaking point, not because of the incident itself, but because of how Mustaine responded when confronted about it. Violence, specifically directed at Hetfield, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By the spring of 1983, with the band on the verge of recording their debut album, Hetfield and Ulrich made the decision. Mustaine was out. He was driven to a bus station and sent back to Los Angeles with his guitar and nothing else. No phone call to warn him. No extended conversation. Just a door closing behind him on what he had helped build. What happened next is the stuff of metal legend. Mustaine returned to Los Angeles, rebuilt himself from the ground up, and formed Megadeth with a fury that was entirely personal. Every record he made in those early years carried the energy of someone trying to prove something, not just to the music world, but to 2 specific people who had dismissed him at a bus stop in New Jersey. But what is less often examined is what was happening on the other side of that equation. What was James Hetfield carrying? By his own later admissions, Hetfield was never fully at peace with how things went down. He has described the decision to fire Mustaine as necessary, and it almost certainly was given the circumstances, but necessary and easy are not the same thing. Hetfield grew up in an environment that did not celebrate emotional openness. He lost his mother when he was 16, a wound that shaped him profoundly and quietly. He learned to manage pain by converting it into work, into music, into a kind of iron discipline that served him well on stage, but cost him in other areas of his life. So when Mustaine left, Hetfield didn't process it the way someone in therapy might. He buried it. He focused. He made Metallica the greatest band in metal, one album at a time, which is exactly what he did. Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All. Each record more ambitious than the last. Each one a kind of answer to a question nobody was officially asking, but everybody knew was in the room. And Megadeth was in the room. Always in the room. Hetfield has said in interviews across many years that he was aware of what Mustaine was building. that the competition, while never spoken about directly in public, was very much alive in private. "We knew he was out there," Hetfield said during a reflective interview period in the early 2000s, not hiding the fact that Mustaine's presence in the metal landscape registered. It registered deeply. The moment that changed public understanding of this relationship came in 2004 with the release of Some Kind of Monster, the raw and unflinching documentary about Metallica's fractured creative process during the making of Saint Anger. The film was intended to document a band in crisis, wrestling with addiction, the departure of longtime bassist Jason Newsted, and the painful process of learning to communicate after decades of burying conflict. But buried inside that document was something no one expected: footage of James Hetfield and Dave Mustaine sitting across from each other for the first time since 1983. The scene is uncomfortable, intimate, and deeply human in a way that most music documentaries never approach. Mustaine, who had spent 2 decades building a public persona around defiance and righteous anger, sat across from Hetfield and said something that stripped all of that away. He told Hetfield that being fired from Metallica had never stopped hurting, that he had achieved remarkable success with Megadeth, Grammy nominations, multi-platinum albums, a fan base that genuinely worshipped him, and none of it had filled the hole left by that bus ride in 1983. He felt, he said, that his contributions had never been properly acknowledged, that the people he considered brothers had erased him like a mistake. Hetfield's response in that moment was not defensive. He didn't spin or deflect. He acknowledged the chaos of those early years and admitted that the decision was made from a place of self-preservation, not hatred. He expressed, in the careful, measured way that has always characterized his emotional communication, something that looked very much like genuine remorse. It was not a resolution. No handshake, no embrace, no dramatic catharsis with a swelling score underneath it. But it was real. And for the first time, the public got to see these two men not as symbols of a genre war, but as people, flawed, scarred, and trying to find language for something that had no clean words. The decade and a half following Some Kind of Monster was a complicated one for both men, in different ways. Hetfield went deeper into his sobriety journey, which he had begun before the documentary, and has continued to fight for ever since. He has spoken with increasing openness about the role that emotional suppression played in his struggles with alcohol, the way he used substances to manage feelings he didn't know how to face directly. Getting sober wasn't just about stopping drinking. It was about learning late how to actually feel things without immediately converting them into something else. That process changed how Hetfield relates to the past. People who do serious recovery work often find that long-buried grievances and guilt come to the surface, not because they're being reopened deliberately, but because emotional clarity makes avoidance impossible. Things you thought you dealt with reveal themselves as things you'd simply numbed. And in that context, Dave Mustaine, who's himself fighting his own battles with sobriety and health, including a serious drug addiction he overcame, and later, a throat cancer diagnosis in 2019, remained a presence Hetfield couldn't entirely set aside. Mustaine's cancer diagnosis in particular seemed to affect how both men related to the idea of time. Mustaine spoke publicly about the diagnosis with extraordinary candor, describing what it felt like to face the possibility that his career, his voice, and his life might end. He recovered remarkably and returned to performing. But that kind of confrontation with mortality tends to recalibrate priorities. And so, as both men moved through their late 50s and into their 60s, the bitterness, though never entirely gone, began to take on a different shape. Less urgent, more layered. The kind of complicated feeling that doesn't resolve neatly, but does, over time, make room for something resembling perspective. This brings us to the present. In interviews from 2023 and into 2024, Hetfield has been more reflective about Mustaine and Megadeth than at almost any other point in his public life. Not dramatic, not confessional in a tabloid sense, but honest in the quiet, deliberate way Hetfield tends to be honest, measured, and real. He has acknowledged Mustaine's creative contributions to early Metallica in terms that go beyond the political. He's called him talented. He's talked about the genuine chemistry they had in those early sessions, the way two musicians can sometimes create something together that neither of them would have found alone. He has also, more significantly, acknowledged the emotional dimension of what happened, the fact that the way Mustaine was removed was abrupt and hard, and that a person in Mustaine's position would have reason to carry pain from that experience. That's not a small thing for Hetfield. He is not a man who deploys easy apologies or performs vulnerability for public consumption. When he says something honest about a difficult subject, it tends to be because he has actually done the internal work to arrive at that place. And the language he uses when discussing Mustaine now, words like complicated, unresolved, something I still think about, suggests a man genuinely grappling with a part of his history that doesn't have a tidy ending. He has also spoken about Megadeth itself with real respect, separate from the personal history. Albums like Peace sells, but who's buying? And Rust in Peace are objectively remarkable pieces of work, and Hetfield, who knows more about the craft of making heavy music than almost anyone alive, is capable of recognizing that. The rivalry, as it existed in its fiercest form, was partly about two bands competing for position. But that competition was also, by any honest measure, productive. Both bands made better music because the other one existed. Hetfield has come close to saying exactly that. The idea that Mustaine's presence, even at a distance, even expressed through criticism and competition, was a force that pushed Metallica. That knowing Megadeth was out there making technically ferocious, uncompromising records made Hetfield work harder, think bigger, reach further. One of the most revealing chapters of recent years came in 2023 when Mustaine disclosed in a widely circulated interview that he and Hetfield had been in discussions about a potential collaborative project. Not a full reunion, nothing so dramatic, but a creative conversation about revisiting some of the early material they had written together before the split. Songs that still carry the fingerprints of both men, regardless of how the official credits read. The idea was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. Two of the most important figures in the history of heavy metal, returning to the place where it all began, not as rivals, but as co-creators. It would have been a historic moment, artistically and symbolically. But it didn't happen. According to Mustaine, the conversation fell apart when he raised the issue of publishing rights, specifically his long-held belief that he had not received proper credit or compensation for his contributions to certain early Metallica songs. When that came up, Hetfield went quiet. Not angry, apparently. Not dismissive. Just quiet. And the project stopped there. Mustaine's account of the moment is worth sitting with. He didn't describe it as a blow-up or a confrontation. He described it as a door closing. Quietly. Almost gently. Which in some ways is sadder than a fight would be. A fight suggests heat, engagement, the possibility of resolution. A quiet door means the other person has left the room. Hetfield's response, when asked about Mustaine's comments in subsequent interviews, was characteristically restrained. He expressed respect for Mustaine. He did not dispute the account directly. And he said something that has since been quoted widely, that his respect for what Mustaine has accomplished is genuine, and that's where things stand. That statement, that's where things stand, is doing a lot of work. Is not a reconciliation. Is not a door slamming. It is a man in his early 60s acknowledging the shape of something he cannot change and choosing, perhaps wisely, not to force it. The publishing question is not a trivial one. Songwriting credits in rock and roll carry both financial and legacy implications. For Mustaine, a man who has spent 4 decades insisting that his contribution to Metallica's foundation was larger than the official record acknowledges, is not just about money. It is about history, about being seen accurately by posterity. And that need, to have one's contribution recognized, is deeply human, almost achingly so. For Hetfield, who has guarded the Metallica legacy with the same fierce protectiveness he brings to everything he cares about, that conversation may touch on things that are genuinely unresolvable. Not because he is unwilling, necessarily, but because some decisions made in youth calcify over decades into something that can no longer be easily undone without pulling at threads that hold other things together. Whatever the private tensions, something publicly significant happened in 2010 and the years surrounding it. The Big Four concerts, featuring Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax sharing the same festival stages, gave both Hetfield and Mustaine something they had not had before, a shared context that wasn't defined by opposition. Standing backstage at the same festival, watching each other perform to tens of thousands of devoted fans, made the rivalry feel different. Smaller in some ways. More human.